So I now turn to the main event for tonight, which is the presentation by our two eminent speakers, Don Russell and Jane Drake-Brockman. We can't read or hear any news these days without a segment about economic dark clouds. They come in the form of crashes in markets, rising interest rates, rising inflation, low productivity growth, to name but a few. And we'll hear more about this when our speakers present. Their topic is the global economy and Australia's outlook, Geoff Harcourt's contribution to the theory of productivity growth. And you will hear more about Geoff Harcourt from the moderator of tonight's presentations, Emeritus Professor Robert Marks, a council member and editor of the Society's Journal. Don Russell is chair of AustralianSuper, Australia's largest superannuation fund. He has wide experience in public and private sectors, including as Australia's ambassador to the US. Jane Drake-Brockman is industry professor in the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. She is one of Australia's foremost experts on services and digital trade, and also a former diplomat. I mentioned that the session will be moderated by Robert Marks, who was a colleague of Geoff Harcourt, who died last year for 45 years. I now hand over to you, Robert, to take over.
Thanks very much, Susan. Yes, Geoff Harcourt died in December last year, aged 90. Just to give you a brief history of his life, there is an obituary which we published in the December issue of the journal. But he was born in Melbourne and he studied at Melbourne University, did a master's and then got a scholarship and went to Cambridge. After he finished his PhD and he'd done, I think, a couple of years teaching there, he went back to Australia and he taught in Adelaide. In fact, Adelaide was, give or take, when he went back to Cambridge for a few years, his home until he finally retired. And then, because the family was in Sydney, he got a visiting position at the University of New South Wales. I first met him in 1976. I went across to Adelaide to talk about the possibility of a job when I finished my PhD. In the end, I didn't get a job with Geoff, but we did end up as colleagues when we were both at UNSW, and we talked about working together, and in fact, I have many interesting conversations with him over this time. As I say, you can read more about Geoff, his life in the obituary. But I want to say a few words about why we should be interested in his academic work today. With the election of the new Labor government earlier this year, there's been a discussion about the growing inequality of incomes in Australia. And the popular solution has been growth in labour productivity. And this solution, growth in labour productivity, harks back to a highly technical debate about growth and measuring physical capital that Geoff Harcourt played a leading role in during the 60s and 70s. Now, most economists' starting point for thinking about growth is Robert Solow's 1956 paper, A Contribution to the Theory of Growth. And his model relies upon what he called the production function, which is basically a recipe for taking the inputs of aggregate labour and physical capital and producing the outputs of consumer goods and services and perhaps further capital goods. And by the way, Peter Swan, FRSN's father, Trevor, is also credited with these insights. Now, growth can happen when the recipe changes or when the ingredients grow. To measure the effectiveness of the recipe, economists speak of what we call total factor productivity. There'll be an exam at the end, to measure how effective the recipe is at combining these inputs. But there's a problem with measuring capital. Usually capital is measured by, physical capital is measured by the difference between its historical cost, suitably depreciated, and the discounted value of profits which are produced by the capital. But unlike labour, which we can measure in hours worked, it's very difficult. There's no monetary unit with which to value what we might call oil rigs and pharmaceutical patents alike, both examples of physical capital. Discounting requires the use of interest rates. And a group of economists at Cambridge University showed that Solo's method, in his paper, 1956 paper, for measuring capital for use in the production function was circular. Don't assume a discount rate to determine the discount rate. This was a criticism which was eventually conceded by Solo and his colleagues. And it turns out that Geoff Harcourt played a vital role in this debate between the economists of Cambridge, England, and of Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1969, he wrote a paper expounding the differences between the two schools, and he then went on to expand this exposition in a book called Some Cambridge Controversies in the Theory of Capital. This was a masterful guide to one of the most technical debates in economics. And earlier this year, before the 50th anniversary edition came out, it was still available. You could get it within 3 days on Amazon. And eventually, as I say, a new edition was published, a 50th anniversary edition of this book by Cambridge University Press in June, and Geoff had written a new preface which came out with that book. Now, this debate, you might say, so what? This debate of 50 years ago is relevant to the political discussion today about inequality of incomes in Australia and productivity growth. These are linked. Geoff's son, Tim, his one-time student and colleague Peter Chrysler, and I wrote Geoff's obituary, which was published in the June issue, the latest issue of the Journal and Proceedings of the Royal Society. And this outlines not just some of the technical details I've been trying to get across here, but also it talks about Geoff's intelligence and humanity, as well as other of his accomplishments in theoretical and applied economics. Geoff was recognised with an AC in 2018 for, quote, eminent service to higher education as an academic economist and author, particularly in the fields of post-Keynesian economics, capital theory, and economic thought. As we remarked in his obituary, Geoff was the most eminent economist to be associated with the Royal Society of New South Wales since William Stanley Jevons, well known to historians of economic thought, who was a member of the Philosophical Society, one of the forerunners of the Royal Society, in 1856 to 1859 when he worked at the Royal Mint here in Sydney. Finally, no tribute session in Geoff's memory would be complete without mention of his humour, his interest in others, his concern for the wider world, and his achievement in leaving a better world behind. So now I want to turn to our two guest speakers, Jane and Don. And Jane is going to discuss the question, is this the end of globalisation? And Don will ask, is this the end of stable prices? I think we're going to have a discussion between the two of them, or, well, maybe, we'll see. Anyway, if I could ask the two of them to come up.
Okay, well, I'll kick off then. Don and I decided to ask two big questions which might engage with the general audience. and in true Geoff Harcourt style might provoke a bit of controversy. He was not someone to shy away from controversy. So let me start with what is globalisation, because after all, the word originated in economic jargon. It had a very specific meaning. It's come to mean many different things to everybody probably, and most of them negative things. But initially in economics, it meant sourcing or buying all of your production inputs from lots of different locations all around the world and selling your production output in lots of different market destinations all over the world. It's actually a business model. Now, that particular business model was slightly different from the earlier approach, where a big multinational corporation would invest in building a production site offshore in order particularly to be close to a specific large and growing market destination. And in time, as transport costs came down and telecommunications costs came down, the globalisation model became the prevalent one, where merchandise is assembled in a factory located where some components are sourced and others are brought in from elsewhere, including from the home market of the investor, if you like, and the final products distributed to multiple different markets, including back to the home investment destination. So production became organised along what we call a global supply chain, or what economists call global value chains, because value is added at each step in that pathway to market. The consumer tends to see only the final product rather than all those embedded components. But the reality is that for nearly 3 decades now, more than 2/3 of world merchandise trade has been organised this way. That is, most things, I'm talking merchandise, most things are literally made in the world via business-to-business links, trade links. And that is what we call globalisation, at least when we're talking to other economists. So is there any economic reason why this might come to an end? Well, before I specifically address that, I need to explain one more thing, and that is that the services industries have generally been slower to globalise. One reason is that traditionally, and I say traditionally because I think this is changing and very quickly now, but traditionally, people like immediate face-to-face interaction with their doctor, their nurse, their lawyer, their bank teller, their architect, their IT support person, and this has traditionally limited the tradability of many services. But it is changing very rapidly now as we enter the digital age, and services are becoming delivered remotely, traded online, including in their own very complex cross-border supply chains. And the digital platforms over which they're sold and traded themselves are digital services and themselves produced via complex international business-to-business transactions in the process of creating a digital platform. So back to the question then, why might anyone think this process might come to an end? One reason is that the lockdowns associated with the recent pandemic delivered a major shock to the functioning of many global supply chains, some of which proved insufficiently robust and didn't survive. Others which survived didn't prove sufficiently resilient to bounce back quickly. And the result was, and we all experienced it, merchandise supply disruption on a global scale, including of essential goods like PPE or vaccines, and essential services like logistics or maritime transport. So shocks of that kind naturally generate in the business community itself a major business risk management rethink about diversification of sources of components. But protectionism never takes long to rear its head when an opportunity arises. So the business risk management rethink soon became mixed with a kind of community fear response and with very strident calls in many parts of the world for reshoring or at least near-shoring of productive activity in order to provide a backup insurance policy against future supply chain shock. And we've seen that play out in the political realm, including in Australia. Now, interestingly, in the Asia-Pacific region, global value chains actually prove far more resilient than anywhere else in the world. We actually suffered from this much less than in the United States or Europe. Most investors in the region, again for good risk management purposes, had already adopted what I call a China +1 strategy. Most of them were making sure that they had access to components not only built in Factory Asia in the Pearl River Delta, but also in one of the emerging ASEAN economies in Factory ASEAN. So in some capitals around the world, and Washington DC is one, the call for reshoring was very loud and clear, certainly louder even than anything we have experienced yet. And as the geostrategic environment continued to decline, specifically the US-China tech war, as we tend to call it, or more recently now, with respect to Russia's war against the Ukraine, we started to hear calls for friendshoring, meaning let's just trade and invest with those trading partners with whom we share common values. So these days, there's no question that in multiple capitals around the world, and Canberra is no exception, and it's essentially a bipartisan matter, the security policy community is on the ascendancy and the trade policy community has dropped towards the bottom of the pile. Trade ministers everywhere have a really tough time today winning any battle in cabinet. So it's a very dangerous time for trade. So do I think this is the end of globalisation? Well, you know, I'm an eternal optimist. I'm going to leave the black clouds to dawn. But I do not. In fact, as I see it, on the contrary. So let me explain why I see it in a positive sense. We are no longer on the cusp. We are now well and truly into the digital transformation, the fourth industrial revolution. And some commentators, CSIRO included, claim that just 3 months of the first year of the pandemic saw digital transformation that had been expected to take about a decade. So businesses everywhere, consumers everywhere went online for education services, for health services, for all our shopping, our business meetings, our collaborative academic research, for communication, social interaction and entertainment. And that digital enablement of citizens everywhere meant that the huge impact on our daily lives was significantly less than it might have been. So it doesn't seem to be very well understood, however, that when you go online, you automatically go global. You're probably automatically importing all sorts of global services, depending on what internet server you use, what search engine you use, what software you use, what digital platforms you like to use, what payment providers you use, and which intermediaries they use online, which domain name provider you use, which email provider you use, where and how you store your data, and where in the world you ring for customer support. I mean, most of us log on multiple times a day, and 40% of us now work remotely on a regular basis. That is, we're logging on online over the internet all the time. Instantly, the world becomes your oyster. I don't see consumers or businesses really wanting to turn back the clock on any of that, because turning back the clock, fragmenting the global economy back into its individual local markets, that's deglobalisation. It would involve massive loss of efficiency and opportunity. So as I see it, we're in a transition to a global digital economy. We will all be poorer for it if we hunker down in our own little isolated bit of that market. And the economic opportunity for each and every one of us is just too great. So it's a dangerous time for trade, yes, but I don't think it's yet the end of globalisation. If sense prevails, it's the beginning of the next big, even bigger wave of globalisation. And I think our children understand it better than we do. And in general, they're excited by it and enthusiastic about it. You know, trade is just too readily seen in the public discourse as the cause of all our problems. And we need to remember that trade is also always part of the solution. It's part of the solution not just for growth and employment, but for food insecurity, for the transition to the green economy, for development and inclusion of the poorest and the smallest. And I just think that hunkering down is never the answer to solving any of the world's problems. Retaining an open, outward-looking mindset, engaging in international dialogue and cooperation, resisting protectionist sentiment and all its negative consequences is the only way to go in the domestic, the regional and the global arena. So I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just saying, as an economist, that's what we have to do if we want productivity and incomes to grow. Now for the dark clouds.
Oh, well, thanks, Jane. I was feeling quite up and light-hearted. But anyway, look, I should say just a couple of words before I talk about price stability, about Geoff, because I did participate in a memorial service for Geoff back in February at Adelaide Uni, and as part of that, as Robert has said, I did seek out a copy of Geoff's book. I was a student of Geoff. Geoff Harcourt was a long-term friend, but he was my instructor guide through the intricacies of productivity, capital measurement, and the Cambridge controversies in the theory of capital. And I found that I set myself the task that I would reread the book. Having read it as a student, I would reread it, and I was very pleasantly surprised to realise that Amazon actually carried it as part of their list of books, and that they would deliver it to me within a couple of days. And I thought, what an extraordinary recognition of Geoff's contribution. And there are not many academics who, 50 years after they publish a book, is the book still in print, but that it is viewed as such as an important book that Amazon will keep it stocked, will keep it tracked, and will deliver it to you in a couple of days. And this is the original book. So I did set out reading it. I have to say, I still haven't finished it by the side of my bed, and I am still, it's part of my mission to complete it. It is a testing book, but it is actually a very profound book, and it has influenced the way I have thought over the years about productivity, its measurement, how we should view investment, how we should view capital, and how we should view actually the determination of wages. So it has had a profound practical effect, certainly on my thinking and on my career. But I did read enough of it to get a feel for where Geoff was coming from. And it's on page 55, one of his footnotes I found particularly illuminating. And Geoff was talking about the attributes that made for a good economist. And he elaborated on this by saying it was something, in fact, the model that he had in mind was something that all aspiring and established economists should aspire to. And he described the model, its characteristics are a flair for formulating relevant theory, which clearly, neatly, and excitingly expressed is carried no further than the requirements of the problem in hand. Now, what does that mean? Geoff was always associated with the notion that economics should be about, horses for courses. And what did that mean? It meant that theory was a practical tool that you used to deal with problems. Theory was not a wonderful, elaborate, neat set of teachings that helped you conceivably build ideas about how the world should be. Now, I've added to this notion, and Adelaide University was always, and I've always described Adelaide University in its economics faculty as a school which has been based around the notion of horses for courses. It's not a university that has had a very strong notion about how the world should be. It's been about how the world is and how we should try and deal with it. But as part of my long and varied career, my notions about economists and their use or otherwise was further illuminated when I worked for Sanford Bernstein, who are an asset management company in New York, where there was a very strong view at Bernstein that economists only lose you money. They had an economist, one economist, and they used him to interact with congressional committees in Washington, and they used him to entertain clients. And why did they have this view that economists only lose you money? Because it was a well-developed notion that economists, because of the way they're taught, tend to talk about how the world should be rather than how the world is, and which brings me back to Geoff and his notions that economic theory should be a tool that we use to solve problems, not a starting point for dictating and about how the world should be. Now, I think that is actually quite a useful introduction to talk about, is this the end of stable prices? Because, as you can imagine, this is an area, it's a highly charged topic because prices are linked to real wages, obviously, and they're linked to factor shares, which is about how much is delivered to profits and how much is delivered to wages. So I think it's good to remember Geoff's notion that when it comes to these sort of topics, it's important to use theory, but use theory in a way which is grounded in an understanding of how the world actually works. Well, anyway, I thought it might be useful if, in trying to come to grips with the fact that are we looking at the end of a stable period of pricing? And we have enjoyed an extraordinary period of very low inflation, dating back to the early 90s. I could mention in passing back to the recession we had to have. Inflation has actually been extraordinarily moderate, and it's had an incredible amount of beneficial effects in terms of how the Australian economy has operated during that period. But a couple of factors I think it's worth keeping in mind. The June quarter CPI was up 6.1%. Lot of transitional impacts going on there. 4.9% up for the trimmed mean. I'm happy to talk about what the trimmed mean might be of the CPI. 4.2 is the weighted median. Again, I'm happy to talk about it later if people are interested in that. These are measures of the CPI which try and factor out short-term effects like the cost of oil, the cost of petrol and what have you. But these are big numbers compared to what we've been used to for the last 20, 30 years. Tradable prices have been up 8%, as you probably expect, because of the effect of international prices on wheat and petrol and what have you. But non-tradable prices are up 5.3%. It's been an effect that's been more pronounced through goods rather than services, as Jane has said. But the implication of this is that the current levels of inflation that we are experiencing cannot be explained simply by a few aberrant effects that are coming from the war in Ukraine, the effect on oil and gas, and the effect on a limited number of commodities. So we're dealing with a major lift in the underlying, call it what you like, rate of inflation. So what does all this mean? Well, we can live through a blip in inflation, but it's the second round effects that really matter in all of this. As an observation, seeing as I've spent time in the UK recently, I think it's fair to say that the UK seems to have lost it. There are many factors at work there, but I think it's fair to say that they are looking at not just a blip in inflation, they're looking at something much more fundamental, and they've got problems in how they're going to deal with it. In all of this, it's expectations that are really important. It's not just the current rate of inflation, it's what people think the future rate of inflation is going to be. And what Australia has been living through for the last 30 years is a belief that if inflation rises, action will be taken by the Reserve Bank principally, and that people believe that a lift in inflation will lead to action which will then reduce it. Now, this is really quite a dramatic change from where we were. For those of a certain age, you probably can remember a period when inflation used to run at 7, 8, 9, 10% in Australia until about 1990. During that period, people's expectations were that if inflation lifted, it would just continue to rise. We were all extrapolators, for those who like a technical term for expectations. Since about the early 90s, we've been mean reverters. We've believed that if inflation goes up, it will eventually come down. And the Reserve Bank has had a critical role in all of this. And over the years, I've given Bernie Fraser a lot of the credit for this. For those who can remember, back in 1994, after the recession we had to have, which led to inflation actually falling to zero, Bernie detected the stirrings of inflation returning in 94, and he responded. He responded with a heavy hand. If you can remember, over a period of about 4 months, he lifted the cash rate in Australia by 2.75%, so that's 275 basis points. He did it in a 75 basis point lift, then a 100 basis point lift, and then another 100 basis point lift, all in the space of 4 months. That had the effect that you would expect of slowing the economy during a major upswing. But what it really did was convince everybody that inflation was now locked in to a 2 to 3% band. Now, and that has stood us in good stead for the next 30-odd years. Phil Lowe has now embarked on a similar sort of exercise. Over the last 5 months, he's actually lifted the cash rate by 250 basis points. Much more moderate, 25 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, and the other day 25 basis points. But the intention is similar. It's to change it's to reinforce people's belief that inflation will return, it will not continue to rise. And I think Australia is still well placed in the sense that our expectations are anchored in that 2 to 3% range. Unlike the British, who now believe that inflation is running at somewhere between 5 and 10, and which is obviously reflected in their current spate of industrial relations issues, because people just simply don't believe that inflation's coming back to 2 or 3%. They believe that unless they take action at this particular point in time, they will see their real remuneration continually eroded. So in finishing up, I think the only other two thoughts that I might add to the discussion is that reaching back to the time of the Accord, which is the Hawke-Keating year period, one of the important negotiating discussions that took place between the government and the ACTU at the time was the social wage. For those who can remember that time, Medicare was a very important addition to the social benefits that the community actually enjoyed, and this was part and parcel of government policy. So people were willing to see the social wage as an important part of the total wage discussions. So we're now living through a period where the government is committed to quite major additions to the social wage, not in Medicare so much, but around aged care and around disabilities. So there is the potential here for a broader discussion about the real and the well-being of people. And the other major point of discussion between the various social partners and the government through the Accord period was, of course, the potential use of the tax system as a wage tax trade-off. So I might leave it at that, and be happy to answer Jane's questions in the first instance, but questions that anyone else might have about our likely success in returning inflation back to the 2 to 3%.
So what we plan to do now is Jane will ask Don questions about his presentation for a few minutes, and then the tables will be turned, and Don will have a chance to ask Jane a few questions about trade, and then I'll open it up to questions from the hall.
Thank you. Yes, that's on. So, Don, to put it simply, you conclude that because our expectations are around the 2 to 3% mark, and pretty firmly so, we don't have an inflation problem for the short term anyway. Is that right? Have I understood?
That's where, if you wanted to be optimistic about it, that's the strategy. And I would, as I said, I contrasted ourselves to the English, where I think the probability of success there is very low. I think, as with all these things can go wrong, and because we've seen quite a major lift in inflation, which has had a consequent effect on people's real wages, and people will try and restore that in one way or another. It's whether the processes that drive that override an underlying belief that inflation will come back to 2 to 3. I think we've got a reasonable chance of negotiating that, but it'll be a tricky 12 to 18 months because if we don't start to see inflation starting to track back down over the next 12 to 18 months, it'll be very difficult to stop second round effects working their way through. And there is then the potential that we end up like the UK. But I think at this stage, I mean, the jury's still out, but I think there's a reasonable chance that we will negotiate this successfully. Yeah.
So we turn out, Susan, to
See,
be
I'm not
two
as dark as you
optimists.
might think.
Two optimists here, and we're both minimising the black clouds, which is interesting because we're on the same page. So let me introduce the other dark cloud that Susan mentioned, which was low productivity and how that might actually impact on this. Or I also want to ask you to bring our two topics together a little bit. How the fact that we look like doing better than some other parts of the world, how that is going to impact on, well, let's just take AustralianSuper, on your own internationalisation strategy, on your own, investments offshore, on your own, approach to earning return for your members, because we're doing better here than in some other parts. I just wonder how you might see, the globalisation story vis-a-vis strong economic fundamentals here at home.
I mean, that is a fair question. I think it's certainly our view that the next 30 years are going to be quite different from the last 30 years. And what does that mean? It means that there will be a much greater focus on what national governments do, that the world will become more a collection of individual countries all striving to achieve their own goals, and there'll be less of an interconnectedness between economies than we've lived through. We've lived through a period where people have quite comfortably priced corporations around the world on a very similar basis. That, if you're a manufacturer of bricks, or bricks is probably not a good example because it's not a traded commodity, but pharmaceutical companies in the US, you would instinctively want to price them like pharmaceutical companies in Europe, in Australia, in Canada. You would instinctively price things on an industry basis rather than on a country basis. You wouldn't necessarily price a pharmaceutical company in Belgium differently from a pharmaceutical company in Ontario. I think a lot of that will remain, but I think we're starting to see, or we are already seeing, people building in different premiums and risks associated with different countries. And that it will continue. So that'll make the life of international investors more complicated because not only will they have to consider the industry side of a company, but they'll also have to start to think about where that company is located and the likely risks associated with geopolitical moves and what have you. So, but having said all of that, it doesn't discourage us from the notion that if we are going to invest $260 billion of our members' money, we need to see the world as a potential source of those investments. So there'll be no change to the notion that a large proportion, an increasing proportion of our members' money will be invested around the world.
I find it interesting that one thing we have in common, Don, is that we both look at what the business community does in response to a situation, not only what governments do. But you did talk about a return to the nation state, and so I can't just let that lie. I think I have to pick that up and perhaps ask, does it mean in your mind a retreat from multilateralism? Does it mean a shift? I mean, I talked about hunkering down, but what else does it mean, a retreat to the nation state?
I think governments will be active in areas which they haven't been in the last 30 years. There'll be greater, and I think COVID has reinforced this, there'll be a greater belief that sovereign capability is an important objective in its own right. A lot of countries woke up one day and discovered that they just couldn't get access to a whole range of goods that were really important. So I think you're going to see governments underwriting the development of manufacturing capabilities in their countries, which probably in straight economic terms doesn't make a lot of sense. I think people used to believe that there were great efficiencies to be gained by just-in-time manufacturing. Stocks are a cost. Just having things in the back of your factory is a cost. Keep that to a minimum. I think when people discovered that they couldn't actually complete the work, people have started to believe that, well, we'll have bigger stocks, but we'll also manufacture stuff here. So there's going to be a pullback from simple efficiency when it comes to how a lot of governments view their industries, yeah.
So return to industrial policy positions, potentially protectionist industrial policy positions, and so I need to focus again on innovation and productivity as part of the solution to that, perhaps.
Yes, as always, there will be winners and there will be losers. There will be countries who do this cleverly, and there will be countries who do it in a really dumb way. I mean, we've already seen, countries like Germany who have done extremely well in an increasingly complicated and difficult global environment by being just really smart at being able to develop a whole range of effectively investment goods. Clever technology, clever ideas all built into machines. And so, and world-class, world-beating. So in other words, if you want to be competitive and you're running a business in Thailand or Taiwan or wherever, you've actually got to have the German equipment, because you cannot be competitive unless you actually have it. And so even if we're living in a world where countries are becoming more and more, as you would describe, protectionist, there will be successful countries who have actually specialised in goods and products that other countries just can't do themselves. That they will just have to queue up to buy them. And it'll be those countries that can restructure their industries in a way that they're actually focusing on things that they're really good at, and they're strengthening these things. And a lot of that will be based around skills and training and ideas generation, innovation. From my time in Canberra, when I did head up the Department of Industry, Innovation, Climate Change, Science, Research and Tertiary Education, industry policy. They don't go in for big names anymore. I think I had the world's longest departmental name. Industry policy really is innovation policy. And I think those countries that can make a success of that will be the countries that succeed.
Here.
Perhaps we can turn it around now, Don, and
my question, yes.
you could ask some questions of Jane.
Well, look, the globalisation issue, and is this the end of globalisation? There are a lot of people around the world who gleefully embrace this. They're looking forward to the end of globalisation because they, for a variety of reasons, think that things will go back to how they used to be. There will be smokestack industries in Pennsylvania and and people will get jobs back which they've seen disappear. So globalisation, and it's putting a stake in it, is seen as a big positive in a lot of countries all around the world. What's interesting about Australia is that Australia's been a huge beneficiary from globalisation. We have been underwriting the whole urbanisation of China, and that has just been simply wonderful for us. Unlike the US, and notwithstanding what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years on real wages in Australia have grown 1.5% to 2% for the last 30 years. I mean, we have travelled quite differently from the US. But if all of this is going to start contracting, if our capacity to enjoy huge benefits from trade with China, and China's capacity to expand has been its capacity to trade globally, how are we going to deal with that, notwithstanding issues around productivity, if we're also having to grapple with another shock on top of that, which is to do with the contraction of our role as a global supplier of very effective raw materials?
No, okay, very difficult question, but let me simplify. Our trade with China has largely been natural resource based, the extractive sector, and also agriculture based. It's also been important for the services sector, particularly inbound tourism and international education, both of which have been totally devastated with all our markets during the pandemic. It just seems to me that the answer to your question is to go back to your own comment about there'll be some countries who can do this better than others, and they do it better by focusing on their core strengths and then their assets. I actually think, and this would take me back to Geoff Harcourt in a sense, because I think things have changed today and we no longer just have labour and physical capital. I actually think that the whole shift to the services economy has taken us away from these exogenous given factors of production into a whole string of knowledge, is what I would call it generally, knowledge and data, which are actually endogenous and can be created by government policy and regulatory settings. So I actually think that what Australia has to do is to build on its core strengths in the knowledge-based sector. After all, services are 80% of our GDP, 85% of our employment, 91% of Australian women work in the services sector. This is the knowledge-based sector. We are really good at AI, for example. There's a whole new industry there. In another, CSIRO is saying that I think it's already the global market's 455 billion, something like that. It'll be 655 billion in about 5 years' time. That's a third of our entire GDP. I mean, this is a massive market. Our universities happen to be putting out publications, and our little SME startup communities are really out there globally putting their stamp on this industry. Look at Atlassian for a start. But I just think we don't have to think extractive industries. 3% of us work in the extractive industries. 5% of us work in farming. Look at our core strengths. Look at let's be serious about reskilling. Okay, we need a lot more people trained for the tech sector. That doesn't mean STEM, that means human intelligence as well as artificial intelligence. But we have to think very seriously about encouraging and not delaying the transformation that's underway. So I would say, China isn't the problem. The problem is we have to realise that we are a modern services economy and get on with it. And it's been too long underplayed and ignored in public policy. So that's my quick answer to your question.
I think you're right. But there's an overlay which I think as a society we will have some difficulty coming to grips with, because we have been very successful over the last 30 years in terms of increasing real wages. The first period was driven largely by productivity growth, which came out of the reforms of the 80s and the 90s. The second half of that period, real wages continued to rise, but it was underpinned by the terms of trade. It was underpinned by this huge willingness of foreigners to pay us a lot more than we used to get. This was a windfall, but it was spread across the community through the resources boom and also through huge transfer payments that the government at the time delivered. What we're confronting now, and you're right, there are opportunities here, but we've got to realise where our strengths are. It'll have to be done where we don't have the benefit of the huge terms of trade surge. Fortunately, we are actually going through another little mini surge as we speak. Notwithstanding all the issues with China, they are paying huge prices for iron ore continually. Will that continue? Who knows? But it seems unlikely that if the world continues to retreat into competing corners, that China is going to continue being able or wanting to pay such huge prices for our resources. So we will have to accommodate this structural change that you're talking about, Jane, without the windfall that comes from commodities and conceivably having to absorb negatives. So that could be quite socially challenging.
Yes, and that brings us back to wages, which is the other part of the Geoff Harcourt equation with productivity, and you might want to open up shortly, but perhaps one thing I would say is, because you've just used the expression structural reform, structural change, and that always calls for structural reform. And it just seems to me, I mean, from the good old days when you were chef de cabinet to Paul Keating, then, you know, when we really did see serious structural reform take place in this country, and it's time for another massive dose of it. It should be an ongoing process all the time, and it hasn't been. We're still not a seamless national economy either. We still have very big divergences in regulatory arrangements across the states which impact on our ability to export. So I think that, you know, what we need is a really serious whole of government structural reform process designed to boost the digital economy.
Let me just start first with a quick comment about Geoff Harcourt, who was my friend, colleague, and mentor for many years. And I think he thought about economics as being a way of helping people to get better, help the world to get a better place. So it wasn't pure theory for the sake of pure theory. So it's very important to remember that was the aim that he had behind all his research in economics. Okay. I have a couple of comments, one to Jane and one to Don. Jane talked about globalization, but somehow she missed one of the actors in this whole process called multinational corporations. They have an important impact on globalization, on trade, and the role they play within a country and across countries, which I think is worth talking about as well. Okay, a quick comment to Don. Inflation is a very interesting topic, which I've also studied for a long time. you treated Australia as if it's a closed economy, and I think international factors are incredibly important in influencing inflation to a relatively small, open economy like Australia. Thank you.
Well, I didn't totally ignore multinational corporations because I identified them as the start of the process, but the model has shifted considerably, and the globalisation model is one that a little SME can follow. Everyone can do it. It's not a matter of requiring a major investment in productive manufacturing capacity anymore. I mean, business-to-business trade happens all the time at every level of size of the business community. So we've gone way past that stage where it was the multinationals that were running international trade. I mean, and these days, I mean, all the focus is on, we don't even call the big digital platforms, which are the focus of new tax rules and new competition policy thinking. We don't call them MNCs even, we call them big global incumbents, where they're not owned by multiple companies, they're owned by one. You know, the capital is clearly located either in, we know who owns Alibaba, we know who owns Amazon. They're not MNCs in the traditional terminology of, you know, a multi-nation corporation. These are big global incumbents. And the process of deglobalisation that's been called for is all around a desire to grow one's own big global incumbents via protectionist industrial policies.
Well, just picking up the question about Australia being a small open economy, it's true that you know, a large component of the spike in inflation has been coming from international events, and that will always be the case. We are an open economy, but we do have a floating exchange rate as well. So it is possible for Australia to have a lower inflation rate than the rest of the world, even if the rest of the world is inflating, you know, significantly faster than Australia. I mean, you know, countries have been able to insulate themselves from, you know, the events of what's going on in the rest of the world through the exchange rate. And you know, notwithstanding the fact that it's an inexact sort of set of relationships, it's not a given that we will be forever, you know, swamped by global influences. I mean, one of the interesting things at the moment is that the exchange rate, the Australian exchange rate, is actually quite weak. Normally, the Australian exchange rate would be much higher with the terms of trade that we're currently enjoying. So, at the end, it's how all of these factors work through the exchange rate that'll determine, you know, what happens to Australia's ongoing inflation rate.
Peter Swan, if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, Peter Swan from UNSW. Just a couple of questions. Going back to Geoff Harcourt's great contribution on the two Cambridges controversy, he mentioned a solution there which actually came from my father, which relies on actually toys that were very popular in the 60s and 70s and even earlier, namely Meccano sets. So if you think of all capital as being Meccano sets and being instantly and costlessly adapted to every possible purpose, then you can see that, like labour, capital has its own units, namely Meccano sets, and this issue of the two Cambridges disappears, and you can see that capital productivity, together with labour productivity, determine the distribution of income and as well as interest rates in society. So maybe you could like to comment on that aspect of Geoff's great book. But coming to inflation, I must admit I'm a lot more pessimistic than either of you, because I see our inflation as being almost entirely domestically driven, because we brought in, Paul Keating brought in floating exchange rates. We are insulated from foreign inflation, but nonetheless we're suffering one of the worst inflation rates in the world, competing very actively with the US and the UK with very high rates, and it's going to get far, far worse, I believe. So where did this domestic inflation come from? Well, I think it was actually created by the Reserve Bank. They did something that my father, Trevor Swan, thought was impossible, namely to bring interest rates down to zero, but that was proved to be very short-lived. But how did they do it? Well, they did it through quantitative easing and massive printing of money, and as a result, because they bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Australian bonds, which are now worth a lot less than they paid for it. At least notionally, the Reserve Bank has generated a huge debt loss of hundreds of billions of dollars, and this is all domestically driven. So I'm not nearly so confident that it's purely that this is going to be over with quickly. So coming to the question, what do you think is the role of the Reserve Bank in actually bringing about the very high rates of inflation that we're now facing?
Okay, well, look, the Reserve Bank, as I sort of alluded to in my introductory comments, I think have a critical role in all of this through the effect on people's expectations. I think if people, I mean, it's just one of those things. If everyone thinks the inflation rate next year will be 7%, it will be 7%. And it's important that we continue to take advantage of the fact that inflation has been low for 30 years and that people have built in the idea that inflation around 2 is normal. Now, how long will people's ideas about 2% being normal persist if inflation continues to run at 6, 7, 8%? It'll get increasingly difficult if we're still dealing with inflation of 6, 7, 8% in 18 months' time to convince people that it's coming back to 2. And people will then start taking actions. They will be to protect themselves. And the process of protecting themselves will entrench inflation going forward, which has been the perennial problem with inflation in Australia. So the Reserve Bank is at the centre of just whether we're going to be successful or not. Now, what does that mean? The more people believe that we're coming back to 2, the easier it'll be. But just as Bernie Fraser had to back in '94, he had to take, effectively a hammer to the economy to get people to switch their belief that inflation wasn't just going back to where it was, but was actually going down. Now, life is easier now than it was when Bernie had the job, because we've had this long period of success. So it's one of those things that governors earn their keep during these periods, because it's not a science. It's a very finely balanced notion about, because they're operating on only one variable, which is the interest rate, and they're trying to achieve outcomes which affect everything. So it's a hard time to be the governor of the central bank, but it's the time when we really want them to get it right. And a good governor will deliver, and a governor who we find wanting will be forgotten. So.
Well, Peter, I'd much rather ask you a question than have you ask me one. But I really, all I want to say, and I've hinted at it before, but I find it very hard to go back to just thinking about labour and physical capital, frankly. I mean, for me, Robert, you mentioned pharmaceutical patent, but that's not physical capital, that's an intangible capital asset. That's intellectual property, that's services, that's knowledge. And it's what we don't pick up sufficiently in our measures of total factor productivity. It's a residual that doesn't always find its way through. I think you also mentioned educational quality, and you mentioned business management quality. These are services, knowledge-based skills. At times of technological change, they slip under the radar. We're not measuring everything. I can't help feeling this is partly what's wrong with our, the Productivity Commission is determined that productivity is very low, lower than it ought to be, given where labour productivity has been. And I feel it's because we're in a time of structural change where we are not focusing enough on measuring that essential deepening of intangible capital assets that we have to focus on right now.
There are two people who've indicated they would like to ask questions, and I think we'll have those two, and then it might be time to wrap up.
Thank you both for your talks. I hesitate to say anything. I'm not an economist. I did meet Geoff Harcourt and admire him enormously. I just wonder what the prospects for productivity growth are, having in mind a number of important factors. First, I agree with the comment to do with intellectual capital. And I think you said that, or hinted that there was some level of lack of appreciation. When you look at the competitiveness and innovation of Australian economy, as I understand the statistics, they're very, very low relative to the rest of the world. And there seems to be, there's also that the management of the business also ranks incredibly low. How can we expect any improvement unless we don't diversify the economy more, unless we believe in ourselves more, and unless we move away from this nonsense of dig it up and ship it out?
Questioner, so could you give us your name? Sorry.
Yes, Griffin.
Well, I think I've already made it clear that I agree completely with you, so I'll leave it to Don.
There are fair points to make about productivity, and it's actually related back to our earlier conversation about capital, because how do you actually measure productivity in a service-based economy? I mean, the national accounts for large sections of the economy assume that output is equal to the inputs, so there is no productivity. I mean, teachers, they measure the output of education by the costs of producing it, because how else are you going to, maybe a little bit of extra profits that come from private schools, but essentially a large chunk of the service economy is valued on an input basis, because that's the way it is. So the more people you put into aged care, the productivity there is zero, because you're just measuring it by the number of people you employ and the wages you pay them. So it's not surprising that the productivity growth has been subsiding as over the decades, because more and more of the economy is being priced on an input basis. So that's problematic. And I think we've got challenges to work through there. But with productivity, at least with labour productivity, you've got some chance of coming to some measure that actually reflects the contribution that labour makes. It gets increasingly complicated if you try and take account of the contribution that comes from capital as well, which is why the Arbitration Commission, the Fair Work Commission, and anybody that has grappled with this has always just taken labour productivity as the driver for wage negotiations. Notwithstanding the fact that productivity growth, total productivity growth has been weak in the last 10 or 15 years, it has still been positive, and so there is still a basis of having a negotiation around a lower level of productivity growth and real wages, and that is something that remains to be done.
There's another question.
Donald Hector. I think this has been a very interesting session and a wonderful introduction to the forum next month, which is on the equality of communities. It seems to me we measure productivity because ultimately we want everyone's standard of living to improve. And what we've not seen in the last 30 years is everyone's standard of living improve. What we've seen is rich people's standard of living improve and poor people's haven't. The returns to capital have been far greater than the returns to labour, and that was only demonstrated, I think, last night on Alan Kohler's report on the ABC News showing a graph of labour wages growth versus profits growth. Now, I accept completely the point about different forms of capital. I mean, those concepts have been around for 20 or 30 years within the environmental movement and so on, with natural capital and other forms of capital. But my deep concern is that unless we address the returns to labour versus the returns to capital, as pointed out in Piketty's book a few years ago, I think we are really heading towards a very difficult social situation, as we've seen in the United States and in parts of Europe, where people really get very irritated about this and they see their lives dissolving. And I think that's a challenge we face in Australia, that we don't want to see a divide between ultra-right and ultra-left. We have to return to a sensible centre and to figure out a way for us to regain the egalitarian nature of Australian society. So I'm afraid I haven't asked a question, but I would be delighted to hear your comments.
I mean, simple arithmetic suggests that you're right. I mean, we can't, as a society, as a community, continue to exist in a successful manner if there's a constant shift in the share of national income going away from labour to profits. I mean, well, it's inevitable that if you continue to reduce the share to wages, then there are going to be consequences, and I think that is recognised. I think we have to be conscious of the fact that Australia has actually done quite well, particularly compared to countries like the US and Europe, in terms of maintaining the real wages of the community, and not only just maintaining it but increasing them. I mean, we tend not to focus on the fact that we did, for 20, 25 years, have 1.5% to 2% real wage growth for the bulk of the community. It's only in the last 5, 6, 7 years that we've entered this world of constant flat real wages, which has been the experience of other countries for a much longer period. So we're coming off much higher levels of real wages for the community than other countries that you've mentioned. I mean, that's reassuring in one sense, but we will go down a path, as you've said, of increasing tensions unless we can engineer a growth in real remuneration for the bulk of the community. Now that can be done, and particularly in a world where, as we're living through now, where there is actually a shortage of labour, and it's quite broadly based. It's not just, I mean, we've traditionally had shortages of skilled labour, and we've still got shortages of skilled labour, but it's a much wider. So in that world, you'd expect, or you'd anticipate that we will be able to generate higher growth in wages, but also higher growth in output, because you can't just pay people more unless there's greater growth as well. So it is a challenge. I mean, I think any solution which leaves real wages flat is risking, the sort of social dislocation that would undermine the very, basis of, what we see as a successful Australian community and society.
I certainly agree with that last sentence, and I worry that we're just not looking at what's coming at us. I mean, yes, we have major labour shortages. We also don't know what the jobs are exactly that we're going to need labour for tomorrow, and it's happening very, very fast. I'm worried about the digital divide. I'm worried about our lack of digital infrastructure, including in regional parts of Australia, the digital readiness even of students at schools. I mean, we are already exacerbating the problem when we should be dealing with making sure there's no digital divide in Australia. It's absolutely fundamental to generating the trade-related jobs that are out there ready to come.
Look, I'm sorry, there was one last question, but unfortunately time has caught up with us. Perhaps you could take that up after the session. And if I turn over to Chrissy Slade.
And I've got the fantastic task of thanking our panel. Robert in particular, it was his idea, I think, at the memorial service for Geoff that we needed to do something more. And we were thinking then, what do we need? We need people who disagree. Geoff was such a marvellous person at disagreeing generously. And so we thought this through. The president agreed that we should do it. And Don and Jane, whom I've sort of known, Jane particularly for some time, and who disagree on a great deal of things, became the obvious candidates to talk for us. Absolutely brilliant pair. Each of them, as they've separately explained, brilliant economists who've used their economic skills in policy, in application, and I think that was really important to me. They were also very wise because Lindsay and I were very much pushing them to decide on a topic by about March, and they just said no, and as I think they were quite right. As what the economist said, all that turbulence which we lived through in England as well quite recently, there's just been too much going on. And I think what we've ended up finding was two areas which were so critical. I said I've known Jane for some time. We were undergraduates together when she started talking to me about globalisation and free trade, and she's been trying to get me to understand about services and multilateralism for nearly 40 years. And I think actually that remark that you made, Jane, of security trumps trade is a really interesting one for us all to think about, because from the perspective that I come from, this sounded to me like a really serious and deep political debate, not just about economics, but about the role of the nation state and all that's happening there. Don was a brilliant I heard of first as a brilliant economist, son of a brilliant economist, of Eric, but son also of a brilliant mathematician who taught me mathematics. And so I heard about Don mainly from Judith. And in fact, as it happens, and if I can share this and without being too gauche, both Eric and Geoff taught my mother economics. She went to university as a mother, so we'd heard a lot about it. I think Don has shown that fine balance of absolute theoretical excellence with understanding what the applications are has actually served us in Australia very well. And we've been extremely lucky to have him helping what he's characterised as these last years of relative good luck for us. I recall, from those years when we were all in Adelaide and there were many, many heated debates, perhaps somewhat more fuelled than this one in those days by alcohol, about these economic issues. It was a very, very passionate time, and I think that sense of wanting to do the best for the society is what we've heard from Don and Jane tonight, and I think that's the thing that is so important to us. So I think Geoff would have been very proud to have had this discussion in his honour, not in his topics, but in his honour. So thank you both very much indeed.